how do you make a comic about somebody else's life and, not feel like you're exploiting them, but you're trying to tell their story because their stories aren't really um, told. So I've been doing this for the past year and a half, and it's been really life changing. And then at the same time, I've been a mom with no childcare during the pandemic and trying to make comics about that. And so that whole experience is like literally like kind of made me lose my mind a little bit. I really um don't really have enough time to do any of it. I'm just trying to hack off things bit by bit, but there is a reason why childcare is an important thing. And
Well,
so it's
we're
been
getting the Biden care.
yeah, I mean, just on Monday, my 4-year-old went back to preschool. I mean, not back to preschool for the first, she had her first day of in-person school on Monday after this entire time. And then last year, and I made it a comic about this for the New Yorker, my 11-year-old got really sick, like right before uh, everything shut down. And there was a question whether or not she actually had COVID, but she was tested later, um, and she didn't have any antibodies. But it was diagnosed as, pretty serious pneumonia. And then on top of that, she found out she had Lyme disease, and then everything shut down. So she never um, went back to school. After, like she had 2 days in school, and then everything was shut down.
Right.
So it was really hard. So I made a comic that was kind of like working through all of those things, and also talking to my daughter about what she wanted to share, um, with because that was really important. It's like, and I'm finding this over and over again when I'm working on work about other people besides me. Um, what's important for them to have in the piece. So her thought that I put in the end of the New Yorker comic is, us kids, you adults have seen something like this before, but us kids have never seen anything like this before. And my thought is, well, actually, us adults have actually never seen anything like this before either.
Right. I agree.
But she wanted to say that, so I, I don't know. I feel like I'm trying to dip my toe into all these like kind of frontiers with making comics, about myself, about other people, and thinking about my role as a storyteller, and as an educator too. Like I feel like I've learned so much about teaching comics and the power of people making comics, through my work with the women at this shelter. And I would like to also plug that this piece that I'm doing, about Town Clock, about the women that live in this, long-term affordable housing, is going to come out on Slate soon. I thought it would be out for Mother's Day, but it's just not done yet, and that's the nature of this pandemic as well.
I have to ask, what does your daughter think our context for the pandemic is? Like, what is her sense of sort of the
We've been through
precedent
this
for this
before.
within our lifetime?
Oh, just that adults have seen more things. Adults have seen war and just have a body of experience, that is beyond hers. I don't think
Hmm.
it was very specific. It wasn't like, um, you know, I mean, I've talked to her about like 9/11 before, or things like that,
Yeah.
big group things. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So it's more of just sort of an abstract that we have been through things before, not that, there was an equivalent pandemic in our lifetime.
Right,
She doesn't
exactly.
think we lived through Spanish flu in
No,
1918.
she probably does think that we lived through Spanish flu.
I mean, that also, you've touched on a couple of times. One thing I'm really curious about is what is your process of like trying to bring your subjects in, let them have a say in how they're represented, and how you almost collaborate with them, or has that evolved?
It's really evolved with my daughter specifically. She was the one that sort of put all the red flags up for me about what I should and shouldn't touch. Um, and so, for example, with her, anytime I post something about her, I share it with her first. Um, and and that's an important like conversation that we have to have. But then I'm also thinking about, not doing that so much because she's also a minor and her ideas about things might change. And so I don't want, and the things that I post about other people, I want them to be positive mostly, like it's really hard to, especially if they're a kid. I mean,
But well, Lauren, I was going to say your
yeah,
work has morphed so much over your whole career, and I mean,
yeah,
when I first met you, you were in this crazy band, Flaming Fire. You were out there, wearing helmets and stuff,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
singing, and with accordions and dancing around, and doing these comics. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of Goddess of War. That
Yeah,
was like this huge, oversized comic that. It's kind of the collage sort of style that you used. I mean, it was huge. It was
hmm
what was it like? What was the size of that thing?
I
The
think it was like
pages.
not 9 by 13 inches or so. It was a huge, large format comic.
Yeah, yeah. It
Like,
was
yeah,
hard to shelve, and
yeah,
so that was obviously pre-marriage, pre-motherhood, and but you were doing real fantasy comics, and it's funny when you were talking about doing these talks with the women at the shelter,
hmm
and telling other people's stories is because going to be a comics quote journalist unquote is a real 180 from your early work.
yeah. Oh, well, that's true. But then I was also doing stuff for girl.com, which was a work about my teenage life, and
Yeah,
and
that's true.
those were always uh, that kind of allowed me to dip my foot into narrative, traditional narrative storytelling, and like basically the kind of comics that women are supposed to tell, the kind of stories that women tell touchy feely stories about their own lives. And so I was doing that, but I was also kind of making things up too. Like they weren't all specifically autobiographical. So yeah, so I was doing that, but I feel like I don't know, sometime after I got I've always kind of followed my curiosity. And so sometime after I had Ramona like 11 years ago, I the first comic I did that was sort of had a journalistic quality was one about my husband and I testing positive for cystic fibrosis. Um, and there's a great art editor named Len Small who was working for a magazine called Nautilus, and they put my comic up as like a 5 day web comic, um, and it attracted like a huge following to the site, and it was about this process of Tim and I finding out that we both had this really pretty rare gene, and then our daughter may or may not have it, and we're waiting for the results. And then that dramatic tension hooked a lot of people. But then I also got to go into the science of the gene, and I don't know. I and also just the human thing of what is it like to wait for the results, and what is it when you're pregnant? Everything's kind of conceptual, and you know, your body's changing, but there's no real child in the picture.
Well,
So
I remember when that comic came out, and it was a real, suspense. I
yeah,
mean, we raced to the website every day to see what happened.
right. So that's like the first time I did that, and then I kept doing more straight journalism for Nautilus. But I didn't love doing that because my voice was kind of lost. And so now I look for projects where I can kind of combine everything. Um, so that's kind of where it's at right now.
And it seems like part of that has been, doing like really trying to document a lot of aspects of motherhood, and particularly maybe some of the less sort of glamorous, less uh, things that maybe other people haven't sort of the aspects that people haven't talked about as much. And I know you're working on a book about that as well. Is that
Yeah.
something? Was there a specific moment? Can you, if you think back, was there a specific moment where you said, "Yes, this is kind of my overarching project for the next few years," or was it something where you sort of over time you realized that was what you were doing?
I feel like um, almost the day I had Ramona, and the week after Tim had to go, my husband had to go back to being a full-time worker, my life completely changed. Um, and I I felt like I needed to document it because it was the first time I felt like I was seeing the systemic, just how fucked up our society is. Like
Yeah,
uh,
totally.
all these roles that people. I never felt like I had to fall into a role until I was a mom. And in fact, that was the whole thing with like being in a band and just doing anything I wanted to before I had a kid. And then suddenly I was trapped, but I was trapped with both these like amazing things of having this, human being grow and watching all of that. But then I also, um, my options were so limited. I was so tired. Um, and so I felt like that was really important to document. And I still do. And actually, I see it so amplified with the women that I work with at the shelter. It's like, try being a single mom. And so that's all been really, really interesting. But yeah, there was no real moment. It just seems like everything that I'm doing right now falls into this pattern, except for the Village Voice comics that I did
Right.
for like from 2016 to 2018. Um, but that was a great. I actually took that job, telling them that I didn't ever. I don't think I told them that I was pregnant because I knew that I could, even if I was like had the baby one week, I could still like probably figure out how to get a strip out.
Which is insane and amazing.
And it's really a great way to work for me. Like if I have like a weekly deadline that I have to deliver on.
Well,
Um,
that was, but I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about that because you were doing this comic for the Village Voice, right? Which, of course, is the famous Jules Pfeiffer, like the comic strips that they ran, and but they had Jules Pfeiffer, they had Ben
mhm.
Catcher, all these famous comic strips, and then obviously there was no printed Village Voice anymore. So you were doing them for the website, correct?
Yeah, I did some for the print
Okay.
um, as well. Yeah.
But I mean, how did it feel joining this kind of legendary, publication, doing this, doing cartoons, although at the end of its run?
Um, I felt incredibly honored. Like I love all those cartoonists. And like and I looked at a lot of Pfeiffer, and I was just thinking about the problem with the Village Voice was that it it at that point had like corporate ownership. I was actually told that I couldn't I couldn't badmouth any corporate, like any corporations, or and I couldn't swear in emails
Was
because it would they had
Oh my God.
yeah, so it was like kind of this weird fake thing. But I have to say that like the person that vouched for me and helped me get the job was Tom Spurgeon, bless his heart. And I'll never forget that. He was like, she's good. Like she had a comic strip in The Stranger a million years ago. And she can do it again. And so I felt like this amazing history, but I also felt that I could, if I could get tap into like the public psyche each week and kind of work on whatever anyone, whatever I felt like we were all feeling, that was like a great honor and kind of a cool responsibility. and I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. And I thought I wouldn't be doing anything political, but then I found it hard not to do anything political. But it was interesting because, that you'd pass in your strip on Monday, and then on Wednesday the paper would hit the stands, and that's also when it would go up online. And by then the news cycle had changed so completely that whatever you thought up on Monday was completely irrelevant by Wednesday. So I had to kind of think about ones that were a little more perennial. And so that was pretty interesting situation.
So there's the issue of politics, as you've alluded to, and there's certainly the difference between doing a daily and a weekly strip, but also there's a question of writing about sort of deeply personal things and doing that in real time. I know that I was talking to a contemporary cartoonist who was doing some, relatively real time autobiographical stuff, and this person expressed some regrets in terms of something that they wrote about in their personal life because of how things change. I'm wondering if you need distance there, if you need to be a certain distance away from the subject matter to capture it.
I think best case scenario, you do. So for example, the Mother's Walk, the comic I did about giving birth, I did that, I think, a year after, maybe a year and a half after Sylvia was born. And it was that distance, I think, helped me form a story. Like, it not just being further away from the subject matter, but it also just helped me put all the beats together in my head about what the story was going to be. I just read the COVID piece again, and I think it works. That's when I was sort of leaning on the fact that I'd done so many autobio things that if I did one that was very, very fresh and tender, it would probably be okay. Like, I had enough experience to do that. And I think it worked, but maybe I just got lucky. I don't know. Like,
I think it worked.
Yeah. I find
did
that
work.
one I have no perspective on. Maybe that's the problem with doing things so, close to the bone.
Well, it's very immediate. I mean, it is stream of consciousness, but it's like what was the Simon Hanselman Crisis Zone, right? Like, he was doing his Instagram comic about the pandemic, and it was literally just as it was happening, and yours was a little bit more buffered, but it definitely had that feeling. And we were all floating in space at that point.
Yeah. I felt like that one, I don't think I could have kept the intensity of that. Like, we were really going through some trauma there with Ramona. And so what I've decided to do on Instagram right now is just kind of do colored pencil drawings when Sylvia's in school of whatever's happening in her life, and then that's what I put on just a single image, and that helps me just keep in the public eye, or just keep it. It's an exercise. In terms of the project that I'm working on right now with the women at the shelter is very personal. Like the women's stories are incredibly traumatic, like more intense than I could ever imagine. And yet they've entrusted me with their stories. Like there's a whole, and one woman wanted me to be very, very open about her life. And then I talked to her lawyer, and he said, "Don't do that. uh, don't do that at
Wow.
all." So that's kind of this new project I'm working on. It's sort of new, all new levels of this, where I've been trained to take people's oral histories through this amazing um, organization called Collab Arts, um, who I just have to give them a shout out because they help hook up artists neat with like populations. So they've done work where they put people in prison situations, and they've taken oral histories of inmates, and they've done things with LGBTQ teenagers. So it's a really interesting organization, and I don't really know any other one like it. And so I've spent a lot of time in New Brunswick. And actually, I just taught a workshop yesterday to Syrian refugee kids in New Brunswick. This was just like a 1 day workshop, and it was at a church, and at the end, and it was all outdoors, and it was incredibly fun. And at one point, like the wind came and picked up somebody's comic and blew it on the church roof. It was
Oh
like
no.
crazy, but everyone was just like laughing. So it was really fun. And then they're like, "Hey, do you want to see the chickens in the basement?" And I said, "Sure." And they're raising chickens because these families have um, a farm plots in this farm run by Rutgers University. Um, and so just seeing these kids in this amazing community center in New Brunswick feeding chickens after making comics just touched my heart so deeply. Like I couldn't get over it. And so I don't know exactly, like, you talk about like distance and everything like that. I feel like there's a comic there, but I don't know what it is. And uh that one's going to take a little while.
What does
But I
what
yeah.
does taking an oral history mean?
Oh, good question. Okay. So there's a really specific um way that they train you to do this, which is you sit down in a room with somebody, you make sure that the recording equipment works perfectly, and then you turn it on, and your job is really just your only job as the oral history taker to um, uh, is to prompt the person chronologically with their life and just be a very active listener. In fact, you're just supposed to use your eyes and not say anything if they pause, just to get them to talk more. And it's the coolest thing I've ever done because it's like, and it can last a really long time. Like, could be, I did one that was like 4 hours. Um, and so you're not always even looking for the truth. You're looking for the emotional truth. You're looking for their truth, which is really an interesting part of it as well. And so this group Collab Arts has a whole. I did 3 or 4 oral histories for this project, and I'm going to take another one. Um, Basically, because every woman that comes into this shelter has a story, and whether or not I make a comic about it, if they want to tell it, I think it's a really good experience for them. The experiences that I had with the women that told their stories were they felt that they had some closure on their life when they were done. So that was cool.
So if it specifically doesn't make it into a comic. Are you doing anything with that material?
Yeah, well, so the oral histories that I've taken are going in, some parts of them are going into the comic that I'm working on, and then there's also a public archive of all of these oral histories as well. So Collab Arts has worked with people in prison, and so they have a whole archive of those. So whoever they work with, they archive their work, their interviews. And then there's levels of anonymity too, like somebody can say, resident number 2, or that kind of thing. But yeah, so that part is interesting. Even just people, like, I've been told with this project that I'm working on right now that the work has to feel, it has to be empowering for the women, and that's an interesting challenge, because sometimes empowering for the women is that it's not actually their story anymore. It's another story. It's someone else's story, so that they can sort of leave it behind and go on their own way. Like, a lot of women, the women that I'm working with, don't want to be in their own stories. They want, or they don't want to live in the past. They want to move forward desperately. So that's an interesting challenge as well.
It seems like these would be a lot, like you're saying, these would be stories that they would not want to revisit necessarily.
Right. And so then I take the important parts that are more that are more universal. So, for example, one of the women that I'm working with is going through this very intense custody battle with her ex, and but that's such a common thing that you can talk about that and not be very specific. But the tricky part is that it's the specifics of the story that make it really interesting. Mm-hmm. And so, because that's a good story, it's not just a bunch of statistics. So I've had to make some changes, and hopefully my background as a storyteller, I can, make things interesting.
You mentioned a lawyer before, and I don't know if that was facetious, yeah, or actually you actually dealt with one of their lawyers.
No, I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that so? What is sort of what's the vetting process to determine whether or not something is off limits?
I think that is something that's a work in progress. But like, I think you have to, I don't even know if I should say what I've changed.
Yeah, don't go into any specifics.
Yeah, but I think it has to be different enough that you couldn't pick the person out of a lineup. But I don't even. This thing that you're hitting on here is the hardest part of the assignment for me, because I've been asked to do this job. I think that their stories are really, really important to talk about, because people don't. Because these are really survivors of domestic violence are kind of invisible people in society. Like, now people are just starting to speak up, but for the most part, survivors of domestic violence become homeless. A lot of times, that's why this long-term shelter is there, and so it's important to tell their stories. But and a lot of times they're alone. Like, that's one of the things that bring a lot of the women here together. They don't have any family support. A lot of them have been trafficked here, and so that's a really interesting and tough thing to talk about. And you wouldn't, I guess, one of the things one of the reasons that I really want to talk about this situation is that you'd never ever imagine that these things happen in America. You hear about it like on the news, but you can't believe that people are being put into slavery in America right now, but they are. Um, and and
There, and I mean, this sounds like a joke, but I'm just going to say it. And it's happening in New Jersey.
Absolutely, it's happening.
Yeah, which in New
Like,
Brunswick. I mean,
yeah, no, right,
yeah.
exactly. It's totally happening in New Brunswick. And there are arranged marriages that are happening right here in America, and women that call the police, and the police totally don't believe them and believe the abuser, even though there's, physical evidence everywhere. So so I feel like that's the importance of my role here, is to listen and to tell these stories. But because it's just, yeah. But then I think maybe one of the reasons why I've lost my mind during the pandemic is that it's really hard listening to these stories and not feeling kind of the trauma of the stories. And then coming back to my kids, and, even we're all in this kind of terrible situation, but, I fully know that we're so lucky,
So, Lauren, I feel like one of the things for the comics community specifically is not having our community around us anymore. In
Yeah.
comics we had Mocha. I would see you there every year. I'd see you at Brooklyn Comics Festival.
Mm-hmm.
Even with the kids, I would see you at least a couple times a year, and then other times I'd see you around. I mean, how is that? I mean, I know obviously, with motherhood, it is a lot more difficult, but you would be at these shows. I mean, how is it not having that community around you?
I think that was actually one of the hardest things, um, is losing that sense of self. Like I identify as a cartoonist, and the not having the people around you, and just being a mom, every day in the morning I would help my kid through school, and then try and get work done in the afternoon. And so, yeah, not having those other cartoonists around, and not having that mental space where you feel like you're able to draw without interruption, and then you can share things with friends that are also amazing cartoonists. Both of those things are really hard. And it was funny, for my birthday, I had Gabrielle Bell over and Karen Snyder, both like amazing cartoonists, and we drew together, and it was just, I couldn't even believe that was my life before. But I also have to say that I'm on a special um, Slack channel with a bunch of women cartoonists, like Leela Corman and Vanessa Davis and Megan Kelso, um, and Rena, and Sasha Mardu,
I could
and
hear
Sarah
Heidi just
Glidden.
trying to find a way to infiltrate that Slack room.
No, listen. We all have our Slacks, okay? We got our Clubhouse, we have our Slacks, we have
But
our, yeah.
that has been a lifeline to me. Just having just being able to reach out to those women, and a lot of times, like, people are just talking about motherhood too. Just how do we all do this? Um, so that's been really, really helpful. But I, even in this past week, having Sylvia back to, it's 3 hours. She's in preschool in the morning, 3 hours, 8:30 to 11:30, and I feel just a little bit more that I have my brain back.
Well, one of the quotes that you had in, I think, one of your New Yorker pieces was, at one point you said, "God, I wish I could make art this good about motherhood, but I'm too fucking busy mothering."
Yeah.
And I just felt like that was so, like, like funny, but also like devastating. And it seems like that's something you're kind of like wrestling with every day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like how do you have distance on this thing, distance enough to make good work about it, and yet it's in front of you, and how do you be present and be nurturing as a parent and not be an observer? Like that to me is one of the hardest things. And forever the idea of the artist is not necessarily like the most warm and nurturing human being. It's somebody who's figured out how to distance themselves. Um, and I don't, that's not me. Like or sometimes I don't know, that's one of the hardest things.
Do you feel like sometimes you have like artist brain instead of like mother brain when like in certain interactions, or you're able to be the mom and then the sort of artist kind of takes over in like later on when you're at the drawing board?
I think that's the hardest thing for me. Because I think when I have artist brain and my kids are around and I want to draw desperately,
Right.
it can be devastating. It's really, really hard. And that's why they shouldn't be around so much.
That seems totally fair.
But
Well, Lauren, in your story about the birth of Sylvia, though, I mean,
yeah,
it's very personal. It's
yeah,
very, very honest, and like X-rated even.
yeah, totally.
So
Yeah,
you
well,
don't.
yeah,
I was just going to say you have fewer qualms writing about yourself.
yeah. I have like zero, um, like the fact that like this like mutual orgasm that Tim and I had was the thing that started my labor pains to have Sylvia. That was just like a cool thing, and I just wanted to tell other people about
And
that.
that was too good to leave out. It was too good to leave out. Yeah, yeah.
Do you feel?
Because
I
like
mean,
that doesn't happen.
obviously, this stuff is out there, and at some point, the kids are going to be at an age where they're, going to be interested in your work and want to read it. Do you?
Yeah.
I mean, are you open in your life, in your personal life, in your interactions with your family in the same way that you are in your comics?
Um, that's another tricky one. Ramona recently realized that she could do nothing to embarrass me, and that was a very difficult thing for her. Um, uh, and and I think that there's nothing worse than cool mom. um, like kids need structure and they need um, guidelines and boundaries. And so that's something that as a mother you have to work on. And that's a very different um, that's a very different skill than just letting stuff hang out in your comics. um, the the what I've noticed about Ramona so far is that she's not that interested in my work. And um, and she's interested in other comics, and that's great. And I think she wants to distance herself from all of that. And so I'm not going to really push it except when she's involved. It's funny because the story about the giving birth is actually secretly a story about Ramona. Yeah, I think that she's a character that really comes through in the end. Um,
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
as a but notice how I
Well,
refer to her as a character.
she's the whole point. She's the whole climax of that story when
Yeah,
she sees her sister for the first time. So I mean, it's about a family. I
yeah,
mean, even though it's very much obviously focused through the lens of your experience, I mean, at the
yeah,
end, the reality is that this is, an organic group.
yeah. And it was funny because I just was you know, 20 minutes before this started, I was reading this comic to my, just so I even remembered what I wrote. And I'm looking at Ramona. We're all, scarfing down dinner so I can do this piece. And I read this thing that says, every time I get mad and throughout all the sleep deprivation, when times seem dark, I think of Ramona proudly walking next to us out of the hospital. And that was like a reminder for me not to be like, let's stop eating, go upstairs, get ready for bed. So in some ways, this comic, comics are reminders for, better behavior.
Talking about this, it does remind me of a lot of other family comics,
Yeah.
like Kyla Roberts.
I love her.
Yeah. Oh, she's great. She's
Yeah.
great. You, Anthony and Brian, you know her work, of course.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, yeah. But and I mean, but her stuff is very also like, I mean, I think she, what will the kids think about their, the comics about them is definitely a question. I know of at least one cartoonist who did a whole big series about their family, and then there was a nasty divorce, and I don't know what happened to those comics.
Yeah. I was alluding to, and I can say this without mentioning the person's name because it's in the public record. But and Heidi, I'm sure you'll know who I'm talking about. That there was a miscarriage in one strip, and that was a case of the real time comics being a little too real time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely another thing. Like with doing this comic about Ramona during COVID, like I remember I was trying to finish it up and she kept being sick. And it was so scary. And I kept having to push the deadline back a little because I just needed the story to have a happy ending. And so that was, yeah, maybe that it's crazy.
Let me interject real quick, and there's a few people still around, and thanks everybody for joining us. This is our first time doing this, and hopefully not the last. One, I should mention that we are recording this for posterity, and we'll probably post it somewhere. Ask a question, then by all means, just feel free to raise your hand.
One other thing I was curious about is, we're talking about this idea of distance and the necessary sort of, I guess, like almost like aesthetic distance. At the same time, in Mother's Walk, one of the things you talk about is the impetus for it was the idea of preserving this emotion, that you wanted to sort of get this down before you kind of forgotten it. And particularly, I get the sense of parenthood. There's all sorts of like haze of like nostalgia that kind of settles in fairly quickly. So how do you sort of balance those two things?
I write everything down as much as I can in the moment. And then if a story keeps, needing to be told, if it keeps popping into my head, then I find a way to actually write it. I felt that way very completely about giving birth. Like I felt like this birth story was so intense and emotional, and I wanted to record the feeling of giving birth because you really do forget it. I mean, I think it's a natural thing that you're supposed to forget so you can have more babies later on.
So we actually don't remember pain in the way that we remember other things.
Yeah.
For that very reason, so we can actually go on with life. Apparently,
and I definitely know that you change, stories change in your mind as you tell them to yourself over and over again, and or as you in the process of writing them as well. They take on a new life on the page, and so over the past 11 years I've been doing comics on and off about motherhood, and I do them when I feel like I have a story that's really worth preserving, and I'm going to forget it. I think those are the two criteria. But there's one comic I really want to do of just like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. That the words of that song are so profound when you have a baby, because it's about your personal interaction with your baby and then the whole universe around you. So it's like this micro and macro thing. And I want to do a comic about that. So there's things like that that I still haven't done. And I think if I did that, I would get into the spirit of having a little baby again. I would remember. But right now I have like no memory of it.
Lauren, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your technique, because I feel like you've always been not as bound to the panel.
Yeah.
Your work is very collagey. How did did you use that style for telling the story of the women in the shelter? Because
well, that one, I'm using a 6-panel grid.
I knew it. I could sense that you would have to go to the grid.
Well,
that was such a gotcha question, Heidi.
Well, I was curious, and so I asked.
Tomorrow on the beat, Lauren Weinstein uses
Lauren Weinstein must turn to grid for story.
Well, the grid is important for that one because I knew that it might be run on some kind of news publication. And normally it has to be kind of modular. And if you work in a collage style, it's not going to work very well online. So there were pragmatic reasons for it. But I also felt like there was something kind of, it gave me a good structure. In the same way that being an artist and a mother, there was a good structure for storytelling there. I could just break things up in a very rhythmic way. So that was helpful.
Yeah, I could also imagine if you're telling, these other people's stories, like you're saying, like you were saying before, how you're trained to just listen to them and try to tell it. I just sense that the grid is a better conduit for that. So.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. Like,
well, Scott McCloud could tell us if he were on here. He would explain it all, understanding the grid.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can divide things up evenly in space and time, but you can also hold things out as well. And I definitely designed it so that the pages look connected, whether or not you're reading it as a scroll down or as a 6-panel grid on a page. So yeah, I definitely think that stories lend themselves to the form that you want to use. Like certain ones seem like they're more open. Like there's a very freewheeling and conversational quality to the Mother's Walk, the story about giving birth, and then with telling these other people's stories, it's important to break it down a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been a huge fan of your work, and I do love the kind of open collage type pages, and I think with the birth story, that format really brought it home even more because it was impressionistic. It was you were telling, you were very much giving the very subjective version of what this experience was like. So having the wide open composition really helped the story, I think.
Yeah. I feel like I hit a good stride when there's a page about having like labor pains, and the whole thing kind of goes up and down and up and down, and so yeah, I was trying to get into that visceral sense of what that's like. But yeah, honestly, if I hadn't done it then, I don't think I'd remember it now. I'm looking at this now. I'm like, that happened to me? I don't. Okay.
Well, one thing that I know Brian has asked a couple other sort of autobiographical cartoonists that I wanted to ask you is, what's the process like of drawing yourself over and over again?
It's, I mean, it's easy because I know the way I look at my comics, kind of. So, so it's sort of a default thing. Maybe it's that I feel like I know that's a thing I know how to do, and I don't really question. But and I like how plastic it can be. Like you could draw yourself ugly or pretty or fat or skinny or whatever, depending on the way you want yourself to look in, any given panel. I think that the trick is actually more other people. How do you draw other people and make them really feel like other people?
Well,
Okay.
related to that and what we were talking about earlier, when it comes to asking permission versus forgiveness, I suppose. Obviously, there's a difference between writing about a child and writing about an adult. In terms of the child, obviously, like it wasn't their choice whether or not they were going to come into your life. But there's
Right.
probably a certain expectation when you have a partner that they're gonna factor into it. But I have to ask: do you have to ask permission before you draw somebody's junk?
No, I didn't ask permission about that. I think I drew I drew my husband's penis um a little bit too close to the unborn child inside of me, and he was like, "Please take it, make it a little bit further away." Um, really, really creepy, honey.
I mean, if anything, that's a compliment at the end of the day.
But that was his main. I think that like Tim is a gigantic comics fan himself,
I didn't
and
know where
I
that
was
was
wondering where
going. I
that was
didn't know
ending. Yeah.
where that was ending. Yeah.
and, um, and he kind of, and he's also a big reader, and I think he kind of knows the drill. Like he knows what is what an artist is doing with a story, versus real life and that kind of thing. Um, but I think the biggest thing for me is being like true and helpful to other people's I don't know, helpful, that's not the right word. Trying to be, emotionally honest about other people's experiences, and so having whatever it is about them feel not, too personal. Even if like, I mean, yeah, I drew his penis, but like, how personal is that?
I'm going to say vary, but maybe that varies from person to person.
I'm gonna be on Team Brian here. I mean, he looks great. He looks great.
Yeah,
But
sure.
it is personal.
Hey, listen, all of these male cartoonists have done their autobiocomics over the years and let it all hang out. So,
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But obviously,
know.
obviously there's a difference between drawing your own genitals and drawing somebody else's genitals.
That's true, but like, there's nothing in any of that stuff. There's nothing damning about Tim at all. Like nothing in there, and that's I think where I really have the most trouble is like I would never want to draw something that made somebody feel horrible about themselves. um, and and so that this is like a moment of love. So that's fine. But yeah, my kids have not read that yet.
They will not want to, Lauren. I can just
No.
warn you. That is not something like, if you want to torture them, just show them that one.
Yeah, I think that's I don't know what sick part of me enjoys that. There's the cringe factor of that is so terrible. It's like the exact thing that no kid wants to ever think about.
Oh dear. Are you still doing any normal person, or is that finito?
That's done for now. Every once in a while, I really like that. I like the four, the square, like the four panels. I like the short stuff, and I feel like my best normal people comics were like told like a little short story in that small space. And so I'd love to go back to telling more short stories within 4 panels or less. Um, but I have these other things to finish right now. So for right now, it's not going anywhere.
So let me ask the antithesis of that. The You mentioned there's a Q&A at the end of Mother's Walk with the
Hmm.
publisher, and one of the
Yeah.
things that you mention in it is that this has helped you realize that you are able to do longer form stuff, and it sounded like will kind of serve as a jumping off point. I'm guessing to doing more long form graphic novels.
Yeah. So I have this one comic that I've been working on for the last 12 years, which is a comic about my childhood and my mom. And talk about people that are hard to talk about. And so I have been working on it on and off for, you know, well, actually, like more like 15 years. Um, and so, but then I have, I think probably mental illness where I take on these other small projects like the Village Voice comic or this work with these um, women in the shelter, and I never ever get this book done. And so I've been doing some self exploration and realizing I have to finish this long piece. I mean, at one point it was like 400 pages. Now it's less. Um, so that is what I'm going to get to after I'm done with this other.
Lauren, it's funny because you have been telling me about that book for a long time,
Well,
and
yeah,
when you started it, the industry was in one place,
yeah,
and now it's in a completely different place.
I know, and I still have this freaking book deal, which is unbelievable, and I still have the same editor, which is also unbelievable. The fact that
So
both of those things are still in
that's
place is amazing.
crazy. Where is it? Wait, where is it at? What publisher is it with?
It's at Henry Holt. Um,
That's
Books for
right.
Young Readers.
Oh my God. Because I remember when you started it, it was like, what are these graphic novels for young readers? Well, we'll try it.
I know.
Oh, I don't know if it's going to work. And they did. They were
I know.
trying it and it wasn't working. And now,
Right.
15 years later, I was just at Walmart here and there was like, a
Mhm.
whole rack for kids' graphic novels at Walmart.
Yeah.
Not,
So the thing, it feels like the audience has grown up around me um, as as I've not finished this book. So in that way, it's good, you know. But it just it has to be the only thing that I work on. Like I'm just realizing that. Like, and I'm 40 at the tender age of 46. Like I I can't take on any other projects, and that's the only thing I will be able to do. Um, and then when I finish it, I can just walk away from it. But it's interesting because a lot of the story that I will be telling with this book, it has to deal. It has to. My daughter is almost the age now of me in the story, and so seeing the world through her eyes has been, and then seeing my own mother, um, and thinking about what's unresolved with her. So she is like a political activist and a general do-gooder, but she also is like a huge workaholic, and it's always been hard to know how to balance those things in my own life. These are all very unresolved questions in my own life. And then seeing all this through my mom and thinking about my own childhood, um, looking at what she was accomplishing with awe and yet feeling like, um, do you have to not sleep for a week to do it all? Like what is having it all? And So these are big questions that I've wrestled with over the years and have had different feelings about. And now I can see it through like, way more perspective. I have much more perspective on it than I did before, and also maybe much less. So that is what I will be returning to. But I feel like I always talk about this book like I'm an addict or something. Like, yeah, everything's fine.
That's so funny. Wow.
And I'm going to therapy uh to talk about this. Like, why can't I finish this thing? It's not like I'm like slacking off. Like, there's something there.
Well, Alison Bechdel just had her book come out, and it took her like 10 years to do. So,
Yeah,
it happens.
yeah, yeah. So, and I think the piece that I'm doing about the women has been very helpful in terms of like figuring out how to tell other people's stories in a way that you know seems good. And I've had many conversations with my mom about it too, like what is okay to put out and what's not and all that. So
Great. I think we're just over an hour.
yeah.
This has been fantastic, though. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you've got the strip coming out, or not the strip, but the comic coming out soon that you discussed before. If people are interested in your work, where is the best place to check it out?
Well, you can definitely follow me on Instagram, Weinstein, at Instagram. On Instagram, and then you can look on my website for updates, and Twitter. I'm Weinstein on Twitter as well.